Good afternoon, Dr. Paliewicz. Thanks for joining us today. How are you doing?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm doing swell. How about you?
I'm doing great. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Louisville. I study argumentation and public discourse. I have special interests in environmental communications, social movements, and public memory.
Awesome. And how did you come to study argumentation?
Well, I think like most folks in argumentation, through debate, right? I debated as a high schooler policy for 3 or 4 years, and then also Lincoln Douglas in parliamentary debate in college at Central Michigan University. And I think I developed a number of argumentative and theoretically argumentative questions through a debate without even really realizing it. And I took those questions to my MA program at CMU while working under Dr. Ed Hink.
Okay. And where did you do your doctorate?
University of Utah with Kevin DeLuca.
Okay. And what do you believe the study of argumentation offers society?
Well, really so much. It also sort of I struggle with that question a little bit because it kind of depends on what kind of argumentation we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about argumentation from like a critical, rational sort of Habermasian sense, then in more ways than some, argumentation, unfortunately, I think is a story of failure, right? And because in more ways than some, right, at our current moment, I think, folks like Walter Lippmann was right, when he said that like popular democracy does not work, right? So I think there are all sorts of troubling situations and big questions that need to be answered within the argumentation community about our commitment to like the idea of deliberative rhetoric. Now, if we're understanding argumentation from a post-structural standpoint, which is the perspective that I approach argument from, I think there's all sorts of opportunities for social change, right, and thinking differently and existing differently and using arguments in new and creative ways.
So let's pause for a minute. Can I get you to unpack both of those? So you have a critique, you're saying, of the sort of Habermasian critical rational worldview. So for some people who might not be able to follow all of those terms, would you be able to explain what that worldview is and your critique of it?
Yeah, sure. In short, I think that world of argumentation is condensed into like a normative framework for argument that suggests that good arguments, right, ought to adhere to particular standards in order for them to be effective, right? And I know that's an oversimplification of so many different, right, critical rational schools of argument, but different normative and pragmatic communities of argument today. And although I think that those traditions or that particular tradition of argument has so much value for argumentation and for society, I also think that it doesn't really work. Because so many examples, contemporary argumentative examples point to the contrary, right? Good arguments don't work. If they did, we would have, some sort of like an actionable climate policy that's capable of preventing the apocalypse, right? If that were the case, Donald Trump wouldn't be president of the United States, and so on and so on and so on. So I think that these sort of vexed argumentative situations are forcing or should force argumentation to think differently about how argumentation works.
Yeah, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the notion that of a good reason doesn't necessarily actually change people's mind, so that we shouldn't necessarily assume that a rational worldview.
Right, exactly. From a critical rational perspective, many would have it that, well, the better arguments should prevail, and that policy itself within this idea of a deliberative rhetorical democracy should be influenced, right, by these critical rational substantive arguments, right? But that's just not the case. And I think the global warming debate is an unfortunate but perfect example of this, or near perfect example, right? Where we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Global Climate Change. Yeah, right. So we have this bona fide scientific community that has met their burden of proof, right, for argumentation for, let's see, like 40 years, right? And they've come out with a number of different assessment reports, right, on, on the impacts of global climate change and a number of different mitigation strategies. If you read these assessment reports, I mean, they're substantive in every single way. But, I mean, climate skepticism prevails, right? These ridiculous arguments made by ridiculous communities of argument that are manufactured or generated by a private corporate interests, namely that are invested in the fossil fuel economy, are prevailing. And so how do you explain that from a critical, rational viewpoint?
Right. The better argument is not necessarily winning.
Correct. It's failing miserably to the detriment of humanity.
So what is your perspective then? Or what do you think the argumentation offers us?
Well, my perspective on argumentation is it's a post-dialectical approach to argumentation. And what that means is it does not assume that the better arguments ought to prevail. So in other words, in the work that I've done with Guy McKendry, we have jettisoned normative ideal standards for argument production, and rather we understand how argumentation actually works as networks and forces. And so one of the things that we take seriously in this kind of analysis is objects, and how objects build networks and relations with persons and other objects and ideologies and attitudes and all different kinds of argumentative assemblages in order to create change. And so I think from that viewpoint, I think argumentation has a lot to offer. I mean, of course, I think there's so much value in critical rational forms of argumentation. I mean, I myself am very much influenced by that school. But at the same time, I think that there are opportunities with post-dialectics.
Okay. So you would call your approach sort of a post-dialectic study of argumentation. And in this worldview, what exactly is an argument?
Okay, you were breaking up a little bit, but
yeah,
I think
my internet is unstable. What in the post-dialectical approach to argumentation, what is an argument?
An argument is a force. An argument is an irreducible force that does something in the world. And argumentation consists of networks and forces. And so that's an argument. I mean, think of an image. Or a video, or a corporation, or a movement. All of those involve networks and forces that do things in the world. And even people like Stephen Toulmin, I think, according to my reading, most recent readings of Stephen Toulmin are really prioritize force in argumentation. It's always been really a prized term in argumentation, but we have not yet understood force as something that is ontological.
Yeah, I really like this read that you have of argumentation as force, and I think that it's something that we should delve deeper on. I mean, I think of the manifest rationality, for instance, even in some of the informal logic approaches, as that reason will sort of invites inference, right? That seems to be speaking to a kind of force of reason. Or normative pragmatics also speaks to sort of some of the force of reason as well. So it seems to some extent force is one of the underlying concepts unifying many theories of argument, because if you talk to a lot of argumentation scholars, which I feel like I have now, a lot of them will tell you the inferential structure is a unifying concept of argument. But when you dig down into what is an inference is a force that causes a leap of faith between premise and conclusion.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's such a great point, Justin. Absolutely. And this is also why I appreciate your work so much, right? I mean, your focus on sound, I think, is really...
We're getting a bad internet connection. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Now we're good. We're back on recording. Sorry about internet connection.
Yeah, that's okay.
So what I was saying is that I think that we can see force then as this sort of unifying part between premise and conclusion that does sort of take us through all of it, or what propels us through a critical discussion in the pragmadialectic approach? What carries us through each of the stages?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good reading, and I agree. I mean, force is something that I feel has been in the margins of argumentation studies all along.
Yeah.
And I think we're moving in that direction.
So how do you identify when an argument has occurred?
I would say when forces, objects, relations do things in the world, right? They create moments of rupture, right? But of course, right, we're also still dealing with with disagreement and division and advocacy and things like that. From a post-structural or a post-dialectical standpoint, the only difference is that we're attending to not just arguments as forces, but objects as argumentative, objects and their relations. Right, I'm thinking of the work of Bruno Latour, whom I think is quite useful here, right? Especially his concept of ding politic, right? And he says in the intro, I believe, to his book, Atmospheres of Democracy, he says that we have shifted from a real politic view on objects to a ding politic view on objects. And so he said what that means basically is that objects have moved from matters of fact to matters of concern. And we need to, in short, pay attention to the politicization of things and objects, right, to better realize what he calls this parliamentarity of objects of things.
Interesting. So could you give an example of that sort of politic?
Definitely. At the 9/11 Memorial and Memorial Museum. I mean, here below ground at the museum specifically, I mean, we have over 11,000 different objects that all make really powerful arguments, right? Arguments of victimage and retribution and memory, right? And trauma that are moving, right? And they're argumentative, right? In that way, because they are precisely, right, these moments of rupture, and they're imbued with narratives and testimonies, right, and all these stories that, right, do really powerful things. I mean, one of the effects, I mean, as Maruf and I argue in our book on the 9/11 Memorial and Memorial Museum, right, is that this is a securitized space, right? So these objects create this sense and sensibility of securitization, right, that is enacted or reenacted / carried out, right, in political decision making, right, through the global war on terrorism.
Yeah. And that has really important effects on the way we think about policy, the way we relate to the world. I think that's a really good example. So how then do you go about, once you've identified it, analyzing? What sort of methodologies do you use to analyze argument?
From a post-dialectical standpoint, Guy and I talk about assemblage criticism as a mode of critique or criticism. And what that basically means is that rather than entering this sort of argumentative situation by assuming argumentation ought to adhere to particular standards and measuring or evaluating those arguments against those standards, we map arguments. And so in that way, it's an interventionalist cartography that tracks the relations of objects and forces and arguments that do things in the world.
Okay, can you provide us an example of that?
Sure. So Guy and I, in our first essay, first co-authored essay in Argumentation and Advocacy on post-dialectics, and maps, it studies the global climate change controversy from this standpoint. And it maps the different networks of relations between and among the international scientists, namely the IPCC, and then also the skeptics, right? And so we show in that analysis through this cartography that the networks of climate skepticism are stronger, unfortunately, right, than the networks of the IPCC. Even though they're making absurd and outrageous arguments, right, they have more networks, right, because they're connected to all of these international companies that are invested in the fossil fuel economy, right, and have access to all of these different screens, right, and the images therein, and so forth, right, and so that's sort of an example.
That's a really good example.
Sort of cartography. I can show how this works as like an assemblage, a controversy that has everything to do with these competing assemblages.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm hearing you say is that when you're looking at these assemblages or arguments as assemblages, you're not really interested in evaluating them based on some sort of overarching normative criteria.
Correct.
So this raises, instead, you're looking at them as their own entities. So this raises a question about entities on their own, taking them on their own terms. Or is that incorrect?
Right, right.
So this raises the question.
No, it's correct. I just wouldn't use the word entities.
Oh, I'm sorry. What term would you use?
Oh, that's okay. I would just objects.
Or objects.
I'm just, when you say entities, I'm thinking of Aristotle and all that. And so this is a post-Aristotelian view on argumentation.
Oh, okay, yeah. Post-Aristotelian objects.
Yeah, good.
So how do you evaluate quality? Or how do you make a judgment about these?
That's the most challenging question, Justin.
Yeah.
And my response would be, I really don't. I mean, I mean, so I measure quality, if we must use that sort of troubled term, by asking whether or not these arguments and argumentative assemblages are effective. And so I look at effectiveness and effectivity. What do these argument assemblages do in the world?
So in this sort of sense, you would say the climate skeptic argument assemblage is good?
No, not good, but effective.
Effective. Okay.
Right. Yeah. This is a non-moralist view on argumentation.
Okay. Yeah. So saying this is what they're doing is pretty effective in the way that they're disseminating information.
Yeah, it's working. And so I think this approach to argumentation, precisely because it looks at effectivity, can just help us understand how argumentation actually works in our everyday world. I mean, look at Donald Trump. Right. I mean, the guy is a walking, talking corporation, right? And he has tremendous networks, right? Especially through Twitter, right? And that's how argument works. I mean, Twitter, his tweets are official presidential statements, and they're ridiculous, right? They're personal attacks, right? And you can name every single fallacy in the world, but by looking at any given tweet. But nonetheless, they work.
Right.
And so, if we want to understand how arguments like that work, well, I argue that we need to adopt a post-dialectical turn in argumentation in order to do that, because otherwise we're just going to be banging our heads against the wall all day long, right? And asking ourselves, what's happening here? How is it that these arguments from, right, our Twitter in chief, right, are so bonkers, but they're working, right? There's not really a way forward. And so that's what Guy and I offer. It's sort of a way forward beyond this aporia, if you will.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that. So I guess I was wondering if you can give me another, you kind of did give us, you gestured towards my last question, which was, can you give me a contemporary example? Which is, you gave us a Twitter in chief. But I'm going to ask you for another one because I love these. You're really good at giving me these topics. Tell me you can tell you're a debater.
Oh, geez. Thanks. Okay, so another example would be one that I focused on for my dissertation under Kevin DeLuca at Utah, and that was the study of Rio Tinto. Right, Rio Tinto is an international mining conglomerate that operates the largest open pit mine in the world in Salt Lake City. Right, and so Rio Tinto is like this specter, right? It's like this phantasmic sort of entity, if you will, right, or subject rather. That's just sort of just like hovering around Salt Lake City, right? It's gargantuan, right? It's on every single continent except Antarctica, right? And on, I think, 220 different countries, right? And so Rio Tinto doesn't have a body or a soul, so it doesn't even have the opportunity to argue the way that you and I would, right, face to face. But nevertheless, it's making compelling arguments within Salt Lake City about the meaning and significance of the Bingham Canyon mine, and it does that through different spaces and places, right, such as the Natural History Museum of Utah or the Rio Tinto Stadium, right? So like branding is an argumentative tactic here as well, right? A suburban community, so forth. Through all of these spaces, places, and objects, Rio Tinto is effectively able to imbue its identity within these things, right, in order to present publics with really powerful arguments about the necessity of Rio Tinto and the Bingham Canyon mine.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that's really important that I'm hearing you make is versus a lot of other, to distinguish your approach, the post-dialectics approach versus other argumentation theory that I want to sort of pick up. Am I freezing?
I missed the first part of your question.
I was sorry. I think I was freezing for a minute. One of the things that I want to pick out from this conversation that I think is really important that distinguishes post-dialectics from a lot of the other argumentation theory I've discussed so far is that because you're moving away from the individual, what you're calling post-structuralism, and refusing just to say it's two people like you and I talking, and you're starting to get to these assemblages of objects, is you're able to look at these multinational corporations as relevant agents, as all of these things that have these multinational influence and able to affect huge networks of change.
Yes, absolutely. And that's really the inspiration for this project, right? And I mean, the way that I'm reading post-structuralism is it has everything to do with the calling into question of this singular critical rational subject, right? And so that's why it's so valuable for this kind of argumentative approach, right? Especially when we're taking into consideration the way that corporations work as argumentative forces, right? And people, of course, right, like Cheney, right, and I'm thinking of Martin Hager, right, have talked about organizational rhetoric and like polylogs, and I think those are useful to this endeavor. But in order to really understand how corporations work as argumentative actors, I think we need to call into question the idea of the subject, which is really at the heart of well, the modern day argumentative project, right, in dialectics itself.
Yeah, so to translate that to our undergraduates,
I
think part of that is a lot of argumentation just assumes when you talk to them that's like
that's right,
us talking, and sometimes they're corporations or these large entities, and assuming that us can be abstracted all the way up doesn't necessarily make sense, because corporations have much larger reach and capacities beyond us, what a human can do, and doesn't act like a human.
Absolutely.
And I think that some of the theoretical tools I'm hearing you say liberates it to do all kinds of interesting things.
Yeah, precisely.
I love your project. I think it's some of the most cutting edge stuff out there right now, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Justin. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So what else do you think we should know, or any advice to up and coming argumentation scholars?
Yeah, I would say for students, think broadly about argumentation. I mean, with all of these different kinds of interrelated movements happening right now, in particular, right, with regards to Black Lives Matter, think about how these movements, right, are pushing the bounds of argumentation and reason itself, right? I mean, reason can be the enemy, right? I mean, it has been for Black folks, right? Since the Middle Passage, right? I mean, because reason has been used as a tool for white supremacy to oppress persons of color, right? So think broadly about argumentation and reason. And in addition to that, I would say pay attention to networks and images. And tweets, right? That stuff matters, right? And it's argumentative. I mean, it may not be argumentative in the way that people like Stephen Toulmin have imagined argumentation, or Habermas, but they're nonetheless argumentative in our current rhetorical and argumentative culture, and so they matter.
Awesome. That's a great place to leave us. Thank you, Dr. Paliewicz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eckstein.
Have a lovely day.
You as well.